just a mask. That's all it is.
Let free individual citizens decide what's best for themselves, their family, and their business.
Good morning and thank you.
Governor Jay Inslee is seeking a third term
I'm Loren Culp.
and faces Republican challenger Loren Culp this fall.
The bigger problem that you have.
How will presidential politics impact this race? And while Inslee leads Kolp in the polls, how has Kolp's grassroots campaigning galvanized the conservative wing of the Republican Party?
Voters are ready for a change.
The chairs of the state Republican and Democratic parties weigh in.
Loren Culp is not qualified to be governor of the state of Washington.
Which are the key races to watch this November? Taking the electoral pulse, next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. Washington State has not had a Republican governor since 1985, the longest streak of Democratic leadership of any state in the U.S. And with a double-digit lead in the polls, it appears Governor Jay Inslee will keep that streak alive in 2020. His GOP challenger, Loren Culp, a police chief from the small eastern Washington town of Republic, has provided starkly different positions on how to handle the COVID crisis, whether systemic racism exists in policing, and more. This week, we're focused on these two contrasting candidates and how party politics could impact your November ballot.
People are masking up.
Washington State has seen plenty of Jay Inslee over the past year, with a flurry of press conferences during the coronavirus pandemic. And he's planning for people to see him a lot more for the next 4 years as he aims for a third term as governor.
I get up every morning thinking how I can help, and I want to keep helping.
Inslee ran in a record-sized field of 36 candidates in the August primary and earned just over 50% of the vote.
We've accomplished a lot together. We secured health coverage for nearly 800,000 Washingtonians.
His campaign has raised about $7.1 million as of mid-October, in the midst of the continuing health and economic crisis of COVID-19.
We're all in this together. We're going to protect our health. We're going to make decisions based on science, and we're going to stand up to Donald Trump.
Inslee disagrees sharply with the president's handling of the COVID pandemic and says his competitor in the race for governor, Loren Culp, is no more than a Trump acolyte.
And I just don't understand why my opponent and Donald Trump think putting on a mask somehow is an un-American activity. It's just a mask. That's all it is.
Beyond the pandemic, Inslee touts his work on climate change and a climate for business that ranks Washington among the best in the country.
And as we come out of COVID, and which we are going to do, I think we should have confidence that we can rebuild our economy because of the things we've done.
Inslee wants to re-examine tax breaks for Boeing as the company plans to move 1,000 jobs out of state.
I do support prosecution of anyone involved in violent activity.
And after a protest-filled summer in Seattle following the death of George Floyd, he's calling for strong law enforcement while also calling out systemic racism.
I am for public safety, and I do not want to reduce it. We also can have a reduction of racial inequity in our law enforcement system, and those should not be mutually exclusive.
I'm Loren Culp, candidate for Washington State Governor.
But Loren Culp, police chief and only cop of the small town of Republic in northeast Washington, says Inslee is way off.
The police are not racist. It's a narrative that the far left wants to use to divide us.
Culp vaulted into a national spotlight in 2018.
Is this, in effect, a sanctuary?
When he refused to enforce the voter-approved firearm restrictions of Initiative 1639, saying the measure conflicted with the U.S. and state constitution's protections of our gun rights.
I didn't think that it would be an anomaly for a public servant to say they're going to uphold and defend the Constitution and abide by their oath of office, but apparently it was.
From there came a book tour. And even though he wasn't the Republican Party's top choice as their 2020 candidate for governor, he earned it with more than 17% of the vote in the primary.
I am Loren Culp, and I will be the next governor of Washington State.
I went around and I talked to the people, and I have the endorsement of the people.
A veteran and former business owner, Kolp has raised more than $2.2 million for his campaign as of mid-October.
Government is there to protect citizens' rights.
He doesn't wear masks at his events, and neither do his supporters. Kolp says with COVID-19, the governor's job should involve informing the people about medical concerns, nothing else.
And then let free individual citizens decide what's best for themselves, their family, and their business. Because a barber shop cutting one person's hair at a time can operate safely, just like a big box store with 150 to 200 people in it.
This state is in a leadership crisis.
Kolp criticizes Inslee for losing federal certification of Western State Hospital, losing jobs with Boeing, and losing control of protests in Seattle that Kolp says needed an armed National Guard response much sooner.
When we have a government and a governor who abide by that rule of law, then everyone is protected equally.
In a state that's had a Democratic governor for the past 35 years, Kolp has an uphill battle as a Republican. But he's energized conservative voters, trying to keep GOP leadership in the Secretary of State's office and pushing back against a Democrat-led sex education bill, which could also impact the nonpartisan Superintendent of Public Schools race. A late September poll showed Inslee had a fairly comfortable 17-point lead over Loren Culp.
I'm elected for 4 years.
The
And
election's
100
already
million
started.
people...
But the impact of this year's uncomfortable partisan rancor will be the true test November 3rd. And joining us for a full election 2020 discussion, we have with us Tina Podlodowski. She is chair of the Washington State Democratic Party. We also have with us Caleb Heimlich. He is chair of the Washington State Republican Party. Thanks to you both for joining me. Caleb, I'm going to head to you first and talk about the race for governor. Loren Culp did not seek the backing of the state Republican Party when he started his run for governor. Now he's your guy. Why is Loren Culp the right candidate for Washington State?
Well, I think in the debate tonight, we're going to hear a new direction for Washington State. We've had Governor Inslee now for 8 years. We've had 40 years of consecutive Democrats in the governor's mansion. And I think there's a lot to talk about in things that we can improve. I mean, just looking at the last 8 years under Governor Jay Inslee, he started by promising not to raise taxes. Then every legislative session since he got in, he's raised taxes. We got the news last week, Boeing Company moving thousands of jobs out of Washington State. It certainly doesn't help that our governor, when he was running for president, compared them to a mugger. So we have a governor that's been hostile to business. He's mismanaged our state's resources. You can talk about Western State Hospital losing its federal certification and the money that came with that. On unemployment insurance, we sent over $650 million to a Nigerian scam ring, while tens of thousands of Washingtonians did not get the benefits they needed in March, April, and May. You look at what's happening in Seattle with lawlessness, with riots, with the destruction of private property. And I think voters are ready for a change in a different direction. And that's what Loren Culp offers. He's a small business owner. He's a U.S. Army veteran, and he served as a police chief now. And so I think that the contrast is going to be quite clear in the debate.
Tina, I'll go to you next. A lot of things to respond to there. I'll let you pick and choose how you'd like to respond to that. But our state set a record this year with 35 candidates running against Governor Inslee in the primary. And clearly the Kolp campaign has galvanized the Republican Party, at least the right wing of it here. What do you make of his grassroots movement to challenge Jay Inslee in 2020?
Well, I think that Caleb is correct when he says that Kolp is the right candidate for Republicans. He is the right-wing candidate for Republicans. And certainly the Republican Party in Washington State has lost any center, has lost any sort of members that are not a part of the right wing at this point. Look, Loren Culp is not qualified to be governor of the state of Washington. There's nothing in his background that would give him the opportunity to be an effective executive. He continues to put people at risk by holding illegal rallies without masks in the midst of a COVID epidemic. And the Washington GOP's down ballot candidates are participating as well. Prior to the COVID epidemic, year after year after year, Governor Inslee has led this state to be the best state for both business and employees in survey after survey, in magazine after magazine. Governor Inslee knows exactly how to make sure that Washington State is a fantastic state, is doing the work that we need for a terrific business environment and an environment where everyone has a sense of equity and equality. We're not seeing that happen with the Republicans. And you've got someone like Loren Culp, who in the midst of the pandemic will not make any position clear on the ACA repeal, one that would take 565,000 Washingtonians off their health insurance coverage. 3.1 million Washingtonians could lose protections for pre-existing conditions, and we'd lose more than $4 billion in federal funding. Let's be really clear, Loren Culp and the Republican Party are over their heads in this gubernatorial race.
All right, Tina, I'm going to stick with you, and I want to move on to the COVID-19 issue more specifically here. We have a state economy that is certainly suffering with COVID closures, and we're seeing cases now on the rise. Do you see this election as a referendum of sorts on how Governor Inslee, Democrats who control the state and House, have handled the COVID crisis?
Well, you've seen this as a referendum on Trump, I think, at a national level, and that's why Donald Trump is going to lose nationally. It's why Jay Inslee is going to win a historic third term in Washington state. Again, everyone, if you look at the polling and seen all that, has given Governor Inslee major kudos for the work that he's done to keep people safe, to make sure that we've been doing the work to keep everyone safe here in Washington state, despite the lack of help and support from Republicans and the Trump administration to get things as simple as personal protective equipment for essential workers, hospital workers, and to make sure that they are modeling great behavior by masking up. Look, Loren Culp is not doing that. In fact, he's not modeling any great behavior. And certainly folks are not going to vote for him in this gubernatorial race if what they're going to base this on is the governor's response to the epidemic. He's done an amazing job.
Okay, Caleb, I'll head to you next. I want to try to focus on COVID if I could with you. Loren Culp told me personally he wants to reopen the state, remove these restrictions on activity that Governor Inslee has put in place. He wants to go with a mask optional approach. Does the state Republican Party agree with Chief Culp's position on this?
Yeah, we do. And we agree. I mean, you look at the governor's response to coronavirus. Yelp put out a review that we have lost 4,000 small businesses in the last 6 months. And in every answer to every question, Governor Inslee, Democrats, they want to blame Trump for everything. They want to talk about federal issues. But when you look at what's happening in Washington state, Governor Inslee has been mismanaging this crisis. He's shut things down. He's chosen arbitrary winners and losers. He's been unfair from the beginning. He's been openly hostile to business. The argument that Washington state is a great place to do business is not backed up by the facts or any of the small business owners that you talk to. And so as we're losing thousands of businesses from Washington state, we need to go in a different direction. We need to open things up. We had a phased approach that Governor Inslee implemented, and then he's pressed indefinite pause. We haven't moved forward for months. And so I think it is time to move forward in allowing people to get back to work, allow kids to get back to school, and move forward safely, but also caring about people's ability to provide for themselves and provide for their families.
Well,
thank you. Please, yeah, Tina, did you have something you wanted to say?
You bet. 7.5 million Americans infected, over 210,000 Americans dead. You know what? A pandemic doesn't know statewide borders. That's why a national response and national investment in the effort is important, as well as not just Trump cutting taxes for his billionaire friends, but to make an actual investment in a pandemic response and pandemic relief, something the Republican-led Congress on the Senate side has refused to do, despite Democrats consistently passing those bills. Look, Trump's own CDC, the Center for Disease Control, just said if we all Americans wore masks for the next 100 days, we'd save as many as 100,000 American lives. We would also create an environment where we can reopen. So going with no masks, it's not following the science. And in fact, it's a bad idea.
So you're changing the subject. Nobody's talking about not wearing masks. We're talking about getting things open. We've been frozen in place for 6 months under Governor Inslee. Washington state has the 5th highest rate of business closures across the country. Other Democrat governors, even the governor of Colorado, pushed to reopen their economy and get people back to work. But Governor Inslee has not followed that model. He's insisted on maintaining control. He's also refused calls from Democrats. Democrat legislators have said we need to call a special session to address this. Governor Inslee has refused. He's refused calls from Republicans, and he's refused calls from Democrat legislators and insisted on going at it alone. This is not the right way to run a state, and it is not the right way to respond to the needs of the 7+ million people of Washington state. They deserve to have their elected officials have a voice in the process, and Governor Inslee has silenced that voice.
Let's be clear.
Okay.
That
Okay. Really quick, Tina, I want to make sure we cover some more ground. Go ahead.
mask optional approach which is what I was responding to on this. That was definitely on topic. And what you'll find is states that have lifted those mask requirements and the shutdown requirements have seen resurgence in COVID as well. And the special session call came before the revised budget forecast, which cut the budget shortfall in half. You know what else would help with that budget shortfall? If Trump would actually tax billionaires and not go after small businesses and individuals here in this country.
I know every answer is going to be about the president, as it has been for the last 8 minutes. But the reality is, Governor Inslee is the leader of Washington state, and he should be making decisions for the people of this state. We are still $4 billion in the hole in a deficit that needs to be addressed. And we're in the process of losing thousands of jobs to Boeing, and our kids are not being educated in the way that they should. And Governor Inslee still will not call a special session as he should.
All right, I want to jump back to another topic here. Thank you for the back and forth on that. COVID's a very important issue, but I want to talk about race relations. Black Lives Matter. And Tina, I want to start with you. This has always been a challenging issue, especially so here in Seattle with a series of protests following the death of George Floyd. A few questions here. Do you think would state Democrats think Governor Inslee has been doing enough work on these issues, for one? And what's the difference between your party and state Republicans when it comes to race relations, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's been very clear that the Democrats have been the party of civil rights, voting rights, rights for equity and equality for all Americans, and the Republicans haven't. Look, even the Voting Rights Act, which has been sitting in Congress on Mitch McConnell's desk to make sure that people could actually express their values and their voice through their vote and make sure that everyone in this country can vote, has been sitting there at the behest of Republicans. Black Americans, Americans of color, have a right to be angry. There is systemic racism, even though Loren Culp, the Republican gubernatorial candidate, denies that he's ever even seen racism. So the reality is we need to deal with racism. Democrats are willing to dig in and do the work on these issues. Republicans are not. Republicans have made it very, very clear that they're just going to spread fear and lies about protesters, about the movement, and try to get everyone into a position where they're fearful to cast their vote and try to steal an election. So that's the Republican mindset here. Loren Culp even said to the Seattle Times that he would have shocked people like Jacob Blake. I mean, that's how blatant this is with somebody like Loren Culp in this gubernatorial race and the Republican GOP.
Caleb, I want to make sure you respond to that, talking about Chief Culp's approach to the challenges of race relations, and if state Republicans agree with his stance on that.
Well, I'll tell you what Republicans believe. Number one, we believe that the First Amendment gives everyone the right to peacefully assemble. And that is an important distinction of what we've seen at times in Seattle. There is a difference between riots and a peaceful protest. Republicans fully support the right to peacefully assemble. We fully support the right to protest. But your right to assemble, your right to speak, ceases when it comes to destroying other people's property, other people's lives, and other people's livelihoods. And so what we've seen in Seattle, can I finish, Tina? Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
But
go ahead,
we
Caleb.
do believe absolutely that every person has value, and Republicans have stood for that historically. It was the Republican Party that was founded to end slavery. It was the Republican Party that pushed through the Civil Rights Act in the 60s. And so Republicans have a long history of standing for equality, of standing for freedom for each and every person, and I'm proud of that tradition.
Tina, quickly, please.
The Republican Party is, if you want to go back to the Civil War, has created a house divided. The Republican Party did not push through the Civil Rights Act. Let's be really clear what the Republican Party is doing. It's throwing out racist thoughts, racist memes, old racist tropes to go after and divide Americans. This is a moment where America and Washington needs to come together. The Republican Party is unable and unwilling to do that. We need people to come together for all of us. And again, None of us support violence at various protests. That's not what we're here to do. We're here to express our values and to make sure that they are heard and acted on. But when Republicans don't act, sometimes people are going to get angry, and sadly, that's resulted in some violence. It's not okay, though.
Caleb, in the interest of fairness, I can give you 30 seconds to respond to that.
Yeah, I would say that, look, what you've seen in most of these destructive riots have not been in Republican areas. To blame this on a failure of Republicans to act is just not accurate. You're talking about Seattle that has a full Democrat majority city council and even socialists on there. The final piece I would say is this shouldn't be a partisan issue. And it's Democrats that are seeking to divide the country and make it a partisan issue. It's hard to come together when one person says, you're a racist, you're a racist, you're a racist, and that's all that they can throw out. And so I think that's why for Washington State, it's important that we have a balanced approach moving forward, both sides represented at the table, and our state is going to be stronger with more Republicans in the legislature, more Republicans elected statewide, so we can have a dialogue where the other side wants to just completely dominate every element of every area of your life.
I need to move on here, Tina. That's been a great discussion on that.
Why does every Republican campaign ad seek to stroke racial division?
That's not true. There is not a single ad that is stoking racial division.
You refuse to actually answer the question about Loren Culp's racist statements and denial of racism. You refuse to answer the question about the fact that Trump is blatantly racist in what he's
saying. You can talk about Trump with every response. We're talking about Washington State. We're talking about the governor's race. We're talking about the future of our state.
Hang on, Tina. Let's let him finish. Go ahead, Caleb.
Well, my point is, look, even at the governor's press conference yesterday, Democrats want to change the subject and talk about Trump, Trump, Trump. The voters of Washington State recognize that when you're voting for governor, when you're voting for secretary of state, when you're voting for superintendent of public instruction, there are things happening in Washington State that are more relevant to your life than what's happening in Washington, D.C. And if the Democrats' only response is to blame Trump, then I think that is indicative of the fact that their ideas are not right on the issues for the people of Washington State.
Thank you for that. I need to switch gears with you if I could. Caleb, I'll stick with you. I want to talk about a referendum that has split our state along party lines, and that's Referendum 90. This is to approve or turn down the legislature's new law requiring age-appropriate sex education for all of our state's K-12 schools. Caleb, what's the state Republican stance on this issue?
Yeah, we have endorsed a reject vote on R90, and the reason for that is when you get into the curriculum, and I believe that the people are going to side with us on this, starting in kindergarten with the curriculum that's been out there is inappropriate, and it's too mature content for young kids. We're not against sex education. We're certainly not against teaching no means no. I have a 6-year-old son. I have a 4-year-old daughter. They matter a great deal to me. But Republicans believe that some subjects should be left for parents, especially at a young age, starting in kindergarten. And so that is what's at stake with Referendum 90, and that's why Republicans are siding with the reject vote.
Thank you for that. To be clear, it's social and emotional learning for those younger grades, K through 3. Any formal type of sex education doesn't happen until later. I want to make sure that I'm clear on that piece. But Tina, this is a big issue because state Dems worked for the past couple years to push this through. Then the legislature passed along party lines, and now hundreds of thousands of opponents signed the petition to get it on the ballot. What do state Democrats want people to know about Referendum 90?
Well, Referendum 90 is absolutely appropriate in terms of making sure that there's comprehensive health education and sexual health education that is age appropriate. It's essential for ensuring students of all ages learn about things like affirmative consent, that no means no, and it empowers all of our youth in embracing their identities, especially thinking about LGBTQ youth or different. Look, I'm a lesbian mom of 3. I have looked at this curriculum. I have 2 sons and a daughter. We have worked through this particular piece of the curriculum, and Caleb and the Washington GOP have intentionally been spreading misinformation about this issue for months and trying to fire up their base on social media with it. He has not made a distinction between materials for students with a variety of resources for educators. And the reality is this is a piece of education that needs to happen in a society that has been plagued by aspects of sexual violence. It's really necessary for folks to be able to go through this training.
Our time has flown by here and we need to wrap up. Thank you for this great discussion. Kayla, I just wanted to ask you a final question. Your thoughts about your party's chances this fall and what you want to tell voters, just with some final words here, please.
Yeah, well, I believe that a government in Washington State, we deserve to have people from all sides at the table. And we are at a risk, if the Democrats keep gaining seats in the legislature, that you're only going to have one party rule. I don't think that's worked well in the city of Seattle. I think it's important to have balance. So we have some great Republicans. Secretary of State Kim Wyman, I think, has a great chance to be reelected. We have a chance to gain seats in the House and the Senate to maintain balance. And I think that taxpayers, the people of Washington State, are best served by having a balanced approach in government, which is why I would encourage people to vote for Republicans. And at the governor's level, we've had 40 years in a row of Democrats, and I think it's time for a change.
All right. Tina, I can give you the last word here. Your thoughts about your party's hopes for the election. Final words for voters.
Well, you can't claim balance if all you're offering the folks are right-wing conservative opinions that do not value and do not respect all the people of the state of Washington. I do think that we are going to see a continued Democratic resurgence in Washington State. I think that Governor Jay Inslee will continue to have a terrific a time as governor here in Washington State, a historic third term. Folks should not reward people like Kim Wyman running for Secretary of State who are doing secret meetings with the Heritage Foundation and instead vote for Gail Tarleton for Secretary of State. I think this is an exciting time for Washington to move forward under strong leadership with folks who respect equity, who respect equality, and who respect differences between other folks, and making certain that those voices indeed do get heard at the table.
Thank you both for your input here, and we will be right back.
What are people on social media saying about the governor's race? One commenter writes, "Governor Inslee, thank you for your leadership, especially COVID and the orcas. Our household is looking forward to getting our mail-in ballots next week to vote for you." Another writes, "Loren Culp wants to be a public servant for Washington, not a politician."
We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Coming up next week, the future of the West Seattle Bridge. It's been more than half a year since its closure, and the decision to repair or rebuild the 36-year-old structure is hanging in the balance. We bring you the latest next week on City Inside Out. I hope you join us.